Hi everyone and welcome. Today I will be talking about 3 new fantasy releases. So these came out in the beginning of 2022. Now, I know that for new releases it's very difficult to decide whether or not you will like it, because for most of them you don't have a lot of reviews out yet. So I decided to put a little bit of the risk on my own shoulders, buy these with not a lot of reviews out already, and then I hope that with this video, with me telling you what worked for me, what didn't work for me, you can decide based on your own preferences if you want to pick up any of these books and spend your money on them. So I will go from least favorite to most favorite book, but in this video I will be talking about The Amber Crown by Jacey Bedford, Temple of No God by H.M. Long, and of course Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Su Tan. And I have talked about this book on my channel quite a bit of times already. And unfortunately I will be starting with The Amber Crown by Jacey Bedford because this was a DNF. So of course I will not be able to give you a full review about the entire book because I did DNF it halfway through, but I can tell you what I thought of that first half and why I decided not to continue. Basically, the premise here is very interesting. First of all, this is an adult fantasy standalone. I love to read a fantasy standalone from time to time. I do think that standalones are hidden gems, so I had quite high expectations, especially because the premise sounded super interesting. Basically, in this book, when it starts, the king has died. He has been poisoned by an assassin. And you follow, first of all, the bodyguard, who of course failed his duty to protect the king. You follow the assassin, who is guilty of killing the king. And you follow a witch who is part of a traveling group of people. Now, how all of these come together, you will not know based on the premise. You will learn this throughout the story, of course. But what I thought was very cool is that in the premise, they say that the dead king gives all 3 of them a task, and that they are being guided by the ghost of the dead king. Now, first of all, of course, I'm only halfway through, but at that point in time, I do think that that part of the plot, that part of the premise, is not really explored that much. It's one little scene and that's it. So basically, you are just following these 3 people after the death of the king. Don't really put too much of your eggs in one basket with, oh, we will have that ghost of the king a lot of the times, because that's really not the case here. I do think that in the beginning, I really enjoyed it. I must say that this is very fast-paced. It's only 450 pages and you have more than 90 chapters, so each chapter is very short. That's something that I can find quite refreshing at times, and you keep wanting to read more. You keep saying, oh, one more chapter, because it's only 4 pages. It's not that long, it's not a big investment. Because of that, the story does progress quite quickly. I think that the characters are not extremely well developed, but they are well developed in a part that all of them have a backstory, all of them have a very distinguishable character trait, and some of them are quite likable. And I also really liked the plot and where this was going. I liked the world. This is almost historical fantasy in this sense that, yes, this is a secondary fantasy world, but you can recognize a lot of our own world here. You don't have that much magic. There is some, not everybody has it, but some people have. And of course you have one witch that you follow, so one main POV at the very least has a lot of magic around her and magical abilities. Now, the reason that I DNF'd this, and this is a big one, is, how should I put this? The magic in the beginning was very interesting and I wanted to learn more, but at the point that I DNF'd it was starting to get ridiculous. So basically we have a witch here, and among the traveling folk, people say that you should not sleep with that witch because something might happen to your lower body parts. Okay, that's something that could be, I didn't really pay a lot of attention to that, I kept reading. And at the part where I am at, something really happened with somebody's body parts. In detail, I should say. And after that, one of our main characters kept having a dream about that body part being very big, being purple, chasing them. And at that point, that was just too ridiculous and I couldn't continue reading. And I thought, okay, if this is like one instance that this happened and this is ridiculous and we can move on and we can just forget that that extremely ridiculous scene was in the book, that would be fine. But they kept turning back to that scene and having flashbacks and having nightmares about that scene, that it just felt like a comedy almost, like, should I take this seriously? So that was extremely cringy. We also have one main character who I think you are supposed to like, and he has a sexual relationship with another character. Everything is in consent, that's fine. But when that female character does something that our main character likes, he's calling her a good girl the entire time, in his head, out loud. I don't even know if it's out loud, to be honest, but in his head a lot of time, like, good girl, yeah, that's a good girl. I like that she listened. And that also really made it a very cringy read. So it started with a lot of potential. I think that the overall plot was very interesting to read about. I think that the main characters are very interesting to read about, but just the magic and the interactions, you could see that should have been polished, and that one scene it should have been cut. Also, up until that point, we didn't really had a lot of mention of sexual assault or rape, but in that instance, around the halfway point, all of a sudden there was a lot of mentioning about that. And I'm not really opposed to that, I'm fine with that, but not if then all of a sudden you keep throwing all of these things. We have one main character who has a history of being sexually assaulted himself, and I don't really like how they try to put like a circle there, like, okay, he was sexually assaulted as a child, so now he has these tendencies, and yeah, it just felt very iffy to me. So in the end, not the greatest read. Also, there is a couple of black characters here, and whenever they enter the scene, it will say Joshua, the black guy, the entire time. And after a while, you should think that people know who Joshua is, and you don't need to remember them every time. Yeah, that's that one black guy that I have in my story. So yeah, overall, started with a lot of promising potential, and it just completely blew it, in my opinion. So I stopped after the halfway point. I don't know if it gets better, and if that one scene just gets left behind, I think that some people might enjoy it. But in the end, I think if I finished it, it would have been a 2.5 stars at best. So unfortunately, one that I cannot really recommend. Next up, I have a fine book. I think that this is okay. I would not say that you have to run to the shop to read it as soon as possible, but I quite enjoyed my time with it. And that is Temple of No God by H.M. Long. Now, first of all, this is being pitched as a standalone novel in the world of Hall of Smoke, which is the first book by this author, and that came out last year, and I have read it. This is not a standalone novel in that world, this is its sequel. I'm sorry, but we have the same main character. If you would read this one before the first book in this series, you would be spoiled for the first book of the series. And for me, those two things, having the same main character and having a chronological read where you should read the first book before the second one, then we are talking about the series and not about a series of standalones. So definitely read Hall of Smoke first before you read this one, even though the author says you don't need to, because you will also be kind of guessing what's happened, because I do think that the author expects you to read the first book, and she doesn't really explain a lot in this second one. So yeah, that's just one thing that I do want to mention. This is a series, come on now. This second book, I had the same issues a little bit as with the first one. So in the first one, we follow Hessa. And Hessa is a priestess. She is the priestess of the goddess Ing, and she's also a warrior. So basically, to bring forth this power, she needs to cut herself, she needs to give blood to the goddess, and then she has this sort of power. Now, in that first book, we learn a lot about the gods and about who they really are and how you can become a god and all of these things. And when I read that first one, first of all, I made the comparison that I had the idea that this was heavily influenced by the Roman period or Roman time period, because Hessa and her tribe felt like barbarians a little bit, while the people that she was fighting against felt like the Roman Empire, or at least members of the Roman Empire. And that's something that I really enjoy. I think that not a lot of influence in our fantasy books come from that time period, and I do think that that's very interesting. So I really enjoy that. I enjoy that we had a lot about the gods in that book. I love it when you have high influence of the gods, when gods walk among the world with and have interaction with our main characters. So I really like that. But I do think that it felt a lot of... It felt very convoluted, especially at the end. The ending was not wrapped up that nicely, in my opinion, and I was guessing a couple of times, like, what is happening here? Do I understand this correctly? I also think that there were a lot of questions, and that possibly in that first book, not all of those questions were answered. Now, that was their debut novel, and I hoped that that would be better in this one. And I think that it was suffering from the same things. So if you really loved that first one, I think that you will also love this one. If you thought that it was fine, same thing. It was basically the same quality, even though that I think that I liked the first one a little bit more. What I also didn't really enjoy here is that in the first one, Hessa is down. She is a little bit depressed, to be honest, and that's completely understandable, because at the start, her husband dies. So that you're not feeling the greatest, that you're traumatized, that's completely normal. Here, something happens in the beginning of the story that gives Hessa the same kind of mindset, and she feels very gloomy, the same as in the first book. But while in the first book that was understandable, Here, it just felt like the author wanted to make Hessa suffer, wanted to make her a little bit more morally gray and a little bit deeper. And that's why something that was completely not necessary happened at the start of this first book. So I don't like that. I don't like when your characters are just unhappy for the sake of it. There needs to be a clear reason, and I missed that here. I also think that the plot here was just not as clear as in the first one. There were a lot of plot holes, especially towards the end. But if I could get over that, I really did enjoy the writing style. I like Hessa as a main character, and I have heard that for the third standalone, which I would still think that you have to read the first 2 books to really get into that third one, it's apparently another main character. So for that one, I'm still excited. If I would have a third book with Hessa as a main character, I don't think that I would have read the third book. Because for me, that first book was the best one. Here, I had the feeling that they had to find a plot to write the second book because they got another book deal. I'm not saying that that's the case, that's just how it felt to me. Because like I said, it had a lot of plot holes and I think that there could have been a better story here. But I really did like learning more about the gods. And that's something that definitely was a plus here. And also some of the reoccurring characters of the first book, I quite enjoyed seeing more of them here. But if you hadn't read that first book and if you didn't have that connection with some of these characters, I think that you would absolutely dislike this book. So yes, even though this is advertised as a standalone, it is not. And then, of course, the third book that I'm going to talk about, this one I highly recommend, depending on your personal taste, of course, and that is Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sulentan. So this is the first one in a duology, the duology of the Celestial Kingdom, and I do think that the second one is coming out quite soon, but I don't know when. However, you can perfectly read this as a standalone. This is one that you can read as a standalone, and I think that you would be very content with it, because it does have an ending, it wraps it up quite nicely. Now, in this one, we basically follow the daughter of the moon goddess. Is anyone surprised? So this is based on Chinese myth, but the Chinese myth focuses on the moon goddess. Here we follow the daughter. Now, the daughter lives in the Celestial Kingdom. She lives undercover. Nobody knows that her mother is the moon goddess. And she tries to basically rescue her mother. And all the while, when she's living in the Celestial Kingdom, of course, she meets people and she develops relationships with people. And that kind of makes her question her loyalty. Of course, she's still loyal to her mother, but now she cares for these new people as well. And sometimes that is very difficult for her. And I really liked to follow her struggle. This does have a love triangle, but I do think that even though I absolutely hate love triangles most of the time, this is done to perfection in this one. I don't think that you could do a love triangle better than here, and I actually quite enjoyed it. But I also really liked our main couple and with whom she does end up with. And I do hope that in this book, we did have a conclusion of the love triangle, I think. And I do hope that in the second book, we don't go back there, because this was enough. We need to let this go right now. I do think that for some people, this might be a little bit too sweet and too neatly packed up. And I can see why not everybody would like this. But if you're just looking for a hopeful read, it does read a little bit younger as well. I think that this is great with just a very sweet romance. But a lot of other things happening here as well. The romance is definitely a big part of the book. I think if you dislike romance, this will not be the book for you. But if you like myth retellings, if you like books that almost feel like you're reading a fairy tale, and if you like a very strong female character, because that's definitely the case here, I would highly recommend this. Especially if you like books like Daughter of the Forest by Juliette Merlier. You will like this. And if you thought that that was a little bit too slow, this is much faster paced. I also like the plot that was separate from the romance and separate from her journey to rescue her mother, because she does do certain things and she makes certain decisions in life to get further and higher in this Celestial Kingdom ranking and closer to the king of the Celestial Kingdom, for example. And I really liked that. And I liked following the daughter's main story and how she developed. So yes, highly recommend this one, and I cannot wait until the second one comes out. So to conclude, in the end, I honestly cannot recommend The Amber Crown. Even though I enjoyed the start, I couldn't continue reading after some ridiculous scenes, and it really went downhill pretty fast. So even if you read the first couple of chapters and you're like, I quite enjoyed this, I'd say please check this out from the library before you make any big decisions. Then, of course, we have Temple of No God. So first of all, read Hall of Smoke first. That's the better one of the two. And if you really like that one, jump into this one. If you're already lukewarm on Hall of Smoke, don't think, well, it's a debut author, this will be better, because in my opinion, Hall of Smoke was the better one of the two. And then, last of all, I think that this is also a debut author, actually. Daughter of the Moon Goddess, great. Definitely pick it up. If anything of the premise sounds interesting to you, it is very well executed. So this is my highest recommendation. I do think that this is worth the money to buy at full price and not wait until your library has it, for example. So yes, highly recommend this one. So that's everything that I wanted to say about these 3 books. Please let me know if you've read any of the 3 and what you thought of it, and if you have other new releases that you want to know more of and that you are excited about reading. If you want to know the other new releases in 2022 that I'm quite excited for and that I will be reading this year, I did make a video about all the 2022 fantasy releases that I was going to pick up, and you can watch that right here. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video, and see you next time. Bye!